Bart Weiss, welcome to the Greg Brown Rule Dimension. Good to have you here, buddy.
Good to be here. Good to be here. So is this dimension a change in consciousness, as though I had maybe dropped some acid and I'm in the sixth dimension of my life? Or what is this dimension?
You know, I think the whole idea of the dimension is related to a project we worked on together, Firebones, because I was thinking about this other dimension called Planet Swan and the project we did together.
Oh, Planet Swan.
And the logo of this show kind of looks Jetsons-y, like vintage American neon. I think I was thinking about all that.
Yeah.
Speaking of other dimensions, we're going to feel like we're getting dropped into a polar dimension here in a few days in Dallas, Texas. Have you heard the news?
I think temperatures will get really, really cold. You know, when I was growing up in Philadelphia, I distinctly remember watching the Dallas Cowboys on Thanksgiving Day, and it would be snowing in Philadelphia, and we would be watching television, and they would be in short sleeves, and I knew that was incredibly unfair.
And that game's coming up, right?
Well, yes, that game is coming up.
And you've got a cousin who's a partial owner of the Philadelphia Eagles?
Let's just say I have a cousin who is very much invested in the outcome of the game.
Are you kind of conflicted sometimes because you've become a Dallas Cowboys fan, right? But you grew up in Philadelphia.
Yes.
And it's an important game this year, and Philadelphia's having a heck of a season.
Yes.
How do you feel about that? I mean, both teams are having a good season.
So, you know, I obviously grew up as an Eagles fan, and being an Eagles fan is not a great existence. You know, for a long time they would break your heart. And but I came down here, of course, and I was an Eagles fan. And not long after I got here, Tom Landry got fired. And what I really hated about the Dallas Cowboys was Tom Landry.
Really?
Tom Landry, to me, was the epitome of everything I didn't like about football. You know, it was all about numbers and statistics and, you know, the way they did that rocking thing. I called it fascist football.
What was it?
Fascist football.
Rocking.
No, before the play, they would like move up and down. They had this gesture they would do. And it just really bugged me. I just really, really didn't like it.
I never liked the Cowboys growing up. My family roots for them.
Mm-hmm.
But it was confusing for me because back then, Arkansas, and we were huge Razorback fans in my family, Arkansas Razorbacks. Jerry Jones was a Razorback. I think he played on the 1964 National Championship team, and as did Jimmy Johnson.
Yeah.
But we were brought up to hate Texas, UT, Austin. And I thought, well, but Dallas is in Texas, and Arkansas kind of had this loner mentality or the kind of an outsider mentality in the Southwest Conference. Back then, Arkansas is in the SEC now, but back then we were in the Southwest Conference, and we were the only non-Texas team in the conference.
Right.
And so, yeah, you just kind of looked at Texas as the enemy, but somehow I was supposed to be rooting for this Texas team.
Well, there's a real difference in the professional team and a college team.
Yeah.
And in so many places around the world, around the country, there is no professional team in your state.
Which is the case with Arkansas. Yeah.
So you have to sort of graft on to like what's nearby.
Mm-hmm. And when Jerry Jones, who was a Razorback, bought the team, that really cemented that for a lot of Arkansas fans that Dallas was our team. And my mother, my sister root ardently for the Cowboys to this day.
I'm sorry for them because the Cowboys often will disappoint. It's what they do. And one of the things as we were making Firebones that really fascinated me was how much the whole state is into football.
Yeah.
You know,
it's the only game in town, you know, the Arkansas Razorbacks.
Growing up in Philadelphia, you know, nobody had that kind of care about any football team. And, you know, there's SMU here, but, you know, SMU doesn't come close to the kind of feeling that people have for the Cowboys. And one of my favorite bits of the whole Firebones program, I would like you to recreate right now.
I had this character called Razorbacker who was a kind of zany sportscaster, and I'm not going to do it right now. I just don't have it's too late at night, I don't have the emotional juice for that. But I am a student of sportscasterisms, these weird verbal tics of sports pundits and sportscasters. And so I loved playing this character because I got to use all those crazy phrases. Like one of them, I have never heard this expression anywhere outside of football. If a player gets injured and then he gets up and walks off the field, the announcer will say, "It's good to see the young man walking off the field under his own power." I mean, I've never heard anyone say under his own power in any other context, but sports people love to say that. And I've noticed that. Actually, I saw an article on ESPN one time, and it used both variants of this phrase. Sometimes people say, "They left it all on the field tonight." And sometimes they say, "They didn't leave anything on the field tonight." And there was an article on ESPN that used both variations of that phrase. Yeah, it's crazy, all the little sports isms.
Well, it was just wonderful to be like, we're out shooting at a whole bunch of stuff. It was a long day. And as soon as you put on that jacket, it's just like that character just came out. It was just amazing.
Yeah, I tried to get one of those kind of gaudy looking, ESPN looking, the menswear on ESPN and other and similar stations is pretty intense.
So if
really
you're listening
out.
to this and you haven't heard Firebones, well, you should really start from the beginning and watch the whole thing, because if you don't know who the Beekeeper Spaceman is, you haven't lived. But go and watch. Do you know which episode that is?
Beekeeper Spaceman?
No.
I think it's in chapter 3.
Yeah, it's pretty close to the beginning.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting comment on what's going on with the character at the time. But it's, as with so many things with Firebones, it is such a unique way to move the story forward from a completely, literally out of left field perspective, although we set it up within the scene that comes before that. But it's just so beautiful and so funny and so Firebonesy.
Yeah, Bart and I did this project called Firebones, which is totally free and accessible to anybody online at firebones.org.
It's free, but it will change your mind.
We're calling it a Go show. It's one story. It's sort of like a season of a television show. It's an online narrative series. But the cool thing about it is that the underlying idea is, at every point in the story, ask yourself, which art form or medium would do the best job of telling this part of the story right here? And if you think it's a podcast, that's really what would do the best job, do it as a podcast. If you think you really need a piece of film, like a video, like a cinematic video, do it as a video. If you think it should be music, do it as music. If you think it should be poetry, do it as poetry. And so we did the whole project that way. So as you're moving, it's really fun, I think, you're moving through Firebones and you think, what will the next episode be? It could be anything, really. And what was cool in the back, even people who've seen Firebones won't know, Bart, is that there were some episodes where we had a really strong feeling like this has got to be video. And then we had some, it's nothing but this has to be a podcast or music or poetry or whatever. But sometimes we didn't know. And those were really fun. I mean, it was expensive because you had shooting video is expensive. You bring a whole, 30-person crew out there. But sometimes we would shoot it as video, do it as a podcast, try it as a song, whatever, and then just see which one did the best job. And I'm thinking of one episode where we did the whole thing as video. It just wasn't working so well.
Yeah.
And when we reframed it as a podcast, the key was that sportscaster, because Razorbacker became the narrator of the scene, and we did it as a podcast, and then it just clicked into place. So sometimes that was actually a fun part from a behind the scenes perspective for me of just
discovery.
Try it out. Yeah.
And the other thing we're saying about the audio podcast, the audio part of the story, is as a filmmaker, one of the biggest problems we have is how to sneak in exposition without sort of making it awkward. And with audio, it's like you're listening in a different way. You know, you're on your bike, you're walking, and listening to beautifully performed, beautifully written exposition is actually really nice. It's when you have the video that you want to move the story forward. So you get these moments when you just sort of enjoy the writing, enjoy the performance, enjoy the story, enjoy the moment. And that really couldn't be done if this whole thing were a straight video.
Yeah, and this is the thing that I really hope other creators will pick up on. I'd like to see other teams, creative teams, do go shows. I'd like to see what other people do with the art form. I think that thing you just articulated is one of the most attractive things about a go show from the perspective both of the audience and of the creator. Because we bring different expectations to these different mediums. I mean, in film, if you stop and tell a backstory or do a bunch of exposition or something, it really bogs it down. I mean, I've seen myself a number of films that just seem to die before my very eyes because of that very thing.
There are many student films that die because of too much exposition.
Yeah, but you go to a podcast for that. You want the linguistic experience. You want the listening experience, the human voice in your ear telling you a story, or when you need to do it.
Expectation of time.
Yeah.
When you're doing an audio podcast is just very different. Whereas with video, it's like every moment has to be sort of powerful and very carefully charged. Not that the podcasts are not carefully edited, but our expectations, the way we use them and think about them in our lives.
And I think there's I think one reason we resist too much exposition in a film is that some part of us as the audience member realizes that this isn't the medium for that. You know, if you're telling a story and you want to explore an idea or do some backstory, do some exposition, if you move to the podcast, you really use the audience's expectations to your advantage as the creator, because you're thinking they're gonna embrace that when it's presented in this medium. So it would be cool I would love that, given that our project was the world's first Go show. It would be really fun to see another creative team take up the form and see what they can do with it.
Yeah, and you know, the thing about exposition is that when you're watching a film, it's like you see X happen and audiences think Y, Z, and whatever. It's like, you know, you see a gun and say, oh, who's that? Well, that happened, this happened, and that happened. It's like the exposition you are sort of imagining as you're moving forward. And then if somebody tells you, this is what happens in the story, you're like, oh, I'm out. I don't want to hear that. So,
well, it's sort of like if you opened up a comic book, which has, really leans heavily into the visual component. If you opened up a comic book and there was like this big block of prose, in one of the bubbles, you'd think, this is not why are you doing this? This is not what a comic book is supposed to do.
Not a single person would read past the 12th word.
Yeah, because something in the reader says, this ain't the form for that. There's been this kind of, what would you say, a real heyday of sophisticated writing in the graphic novel world, but you generally don't get big blocks of text. But the writing is really quite strong. It's just that it's in quick hits usually.
And if you think about the traditional, say, Marvel comics, let's just say the stories are somewhat predictable.
Yeah.
If you've seen one Superman comic, it's like you don't need backstory.
That's where I think the latter-day graphic novelists have injected new life into the form, because they've really brought some sophistication to the storytelling. I read one recently by Alan Moore that's exploring the mythology of voodoo, of Haitian voodoo, and also voodoo as we see it in the American South. And he really he brought a real understanding of voodoo lore to bear on that project. That's something I've studied a lot because there's a lot of voodoo in my home county. And so I grew up with it and knew a lot about it just kind of from living there. and talking to a lot of people, and I wound up doing a folklore project where I collected a bunch of folk tales. And so that was a subject I knew a lot about. And when I saw that comic book, I was impressed to see that he had obviously taken a deep dive into that world.
So, Greg, I want to ask you, as somebody who loves words and loves stories, you started out as a writer, and writing is kind of at the central and the core of who you are, just like for me, filmmaking is at my core. But now your artistic practice is all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have your own personal writing. You have what we did in Firebones. You're now a podcaster, which is sort of radio-based, television-based, live-based. Then you are also a publisher, which is a whole different thing. That you're extending your use of language in one way, as on a page, to all these multi-levels. So how do you sort of navigate as you're expanding into all these different formats? And what do you take that is sort of central and key to each one of these?
That's a good question. And it relates to the story behind Firebones. My core, it's hard to say. I think the two artistic practices that run the deepest for me and go back the farthest into my childhood are songwriting and poetry writing. And poetry has been the main thing I've done professionally. And poetry is something you do all alone. You're sitting there by yourself dreaming up poems. Something like Firebones is highly collaborative. I mean, we had a pretty large team there, so that's one cool thing about that. But I think how this started to happen is that, when I was a little kid, I used to draw. Before I could really write that much, I would draw cartoons. I actually thought when I was a little bitty kid I was going to be I wanted a comic strip. So I think there was always that inclination towards mixing words and visuals, and words themselves to me are multisensory. I experience language as like a non-representational work of art that you can kind of walk into and touch and eat. It's sound, but it's also texture, some kind of spatial play where the word is a tiny thing, but also a vast thing. There's some kind of interesting spatial dimension there that brings me pleasure. Words seem to me to be both miniature and impossibly vast. And sometimes when I'd be writing a poem, just through the years I would notice this, and actually this relates to something that happened in Firebones. I would want to write an image, and I would suddenly think, my cell phone is going off. I should have turned that off before we started. I'd be working on an image, and I would think, oh, the next thing I want to write is really cool, but it's going to be a little tedious to set it up on the page. And this is an example. There's this thing in the Delta. It's a piece of farm machinery called a Georgia buggy, and a lot of them are yellow, and they start to rust, and they get these rust spots. And they kind of look like, they're shaped like giraffes. And especially when they're yellow with those rust spots, they really look like giraffes. And I always thought that. But, to get that on the page, a poet like Frank Stanford, who was also from the Arkansas Delta, he would just slap that down and keep it moving. And it's kind of like if you know, you know. And that can work. But I just knew that a lot of readers would be completely lost on them. They don't know what a Georgia buggy is. Even if you look it up on the internet, will it come up? Maybe, maybe not. It's a very difficult thing to get to click into place in the reader's imagination. And I would think, this should be film. Because what you could do is have a little kid who made himself like a giraffe mask, and he could be out climbing around on one of those Georgia buggies, and you would simply see it. You don't have to know much about a Georgia, but if you see that, you get it. And it would be beautiful as a visual. And so I would find myself not using these images because something in me knew this needs to be on the screen. And so...
And we found that buggy.
Yeah.
I mean, so many times we're out there, we're shooting something, and Greg says, "Well, I've seen this thing, and it's down this road." And your family's like, "She's sure?" And yeah, I know exactly where it is. And by God, we found all these amazing things out there. It's just kind of amazing. Your visual memory is, really powerful.
And that's one of the cool things about the country is that it doesn't change as much. So if there was an old rusted Georgia buggy, out in the Coley field 15 years ago, it may still be there. If there was a restaurant in Dallas last week, it might have closed down and been replaced by another one.
No, it was replaced by a new apartment building going up.
Yeah, condominiums or something. Yeah, not a lot changes around Pumpkin Bend, Arkansas, where I'm from, in the Delta. So that was a real advantage to me during Firebones because I could say exactly. It's like, I know this thing is right over there. If we drive out there, we'll see it.
Yeah, and we saw so many amazing things.
I think that because words have always seemed vividly visual to me, as well as textural and spatial and gustatory, but definitely highly visual. That connection between writing a poem and crafting a piece of film was not as big a leap as it might have been had I experienced words differently. And I had a bunch of head injuries as a child, and I have a kind of confusion of the senses that is consistent with this type of head trauma. I mean, it was crazy. I had a series of them as a kid, and it may have kind of mixed up my senses so that when I hear a word, I'm experiencing sound and sight and taste and smell and so forth. There may be something going on there, and it's interesting. My mother was pregnant with my brother, who's older than I am, and while she was pregnant, my dad, who was farming, was in an explosion on a tractor that sent him flying across the land, just like Superman out across the field, or I think it was actually across my grandma's yard, and he flew through the air and was burned badly. And there's a whole folklore where I'm from around this idea of marking, that if something dramatic happens in the life of a family while a woman is pregnant, it could mark the child in a mystical way. So, for example, I collected a folk tale about a woman who was pregnant and whose shotgun shack was rammed or kind of butted by a cow while she was pregnant, and then the baby came out half cow, half human, this kind of thing. You hear it marked the child, is what they said. And some of the older women in Pumpkin Bend, when this happened, while my mother was pregnant, they said, "Oh, goodness, I hope that don't mark that baby." And when my brother was born, he did have, he looked like half burnt when he came out of the womb. It went away, but so people thought maybe the marking had happened. And it's almost as if it extended to the next child, because then when I was born, like just a couple of weeks after I was born, I was in the infant seat up on the kitchen table, and my sister, who was 6 years older, was trying to get up there to play with me, and she was trying to climb up on the kitchen table, and she wasn't, she's 6 years old, wasn't thinking. And so she just grabbed the edge of the kitchen table and pulled herself up. And when she did, it catapulted me out of that infant seat. And I flew across the room, much as my father had flown through the air off that tractor, and landed on my head and was out like a light. It was knocked out cold. And my parents, there was kind of a country debate back then about, when something like this happens, do you trust in God or do you trust in medical science? And they kind of split the difference. So they took me to the hospital, but also called the women, the praying women of the church who gathered at the church house, which was 3/4 of a mile from our house, and prayed while my parents were taking me to the doctor.
Well, I'm glad they took you to the doctor.
So the women were praying while I was being rushed to the doctor. When they got me to the doctor's office, they put me up on this table, and I just came to. And seemed to be fine. And I think the doctor was just like, he seems fine. And they never ran tests or anything. This is like probably a country doctor kind of thing, you know. So who knows what really happened?
Right. Of course, now if that happened, you know, they wouldn't let you out of the doctor's office unless you had like 16 procedures.
Yeah. So it's kind of a charming story in a way, because you think, well, what kind of magical power was conveyed to my body while I was out via the Pentecostal prayer warriors at the Pumpkin Bend Assembly of God Church. And then I commenced to have a series of head injuries. I jumped out of the back of them. I thought I could fly like Superman. I jumped out of the back of a pickup truck that was going like, I don't know. I mean, it was rolling down the Pumpkin Road, and I jumped out thinking I'd land on my feet. Instead, I landed on my head. My head sounded like a shotgun went off. Just head injury after head injury after head. There's no telling what happened. But one thing that can happen with a bunch of head injuries like that, particularly in early childhood, is that you can have a confusion of the senses, and your sleep can be dysregulated. And both of these things are true of me. I've never been able to regulate my sleep. I'm trying with the help of Andrew Huberman's podcast, which has helped, but it's still kind of tricky for me, and the sensory confusion. So that may underlie this strange relationship to different art forms, because I experience them all kind of as the same thing, just a pleasurable interplay of senses.
Well, fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And so, you know, you have this great love of words. Written words have always been a challenge for me. You know, I'm really...
Although you're a very good writer, I've read your columns.
It's like I have zero confidence in my writing. It's like I just, you know, I can talk really well. I can get up and talk about it, pretty much anything to anybody.
You never seem nervous in public speaking either, I've noticed.
No, well, I've been teaching for so long.
Yeah, that helps.
You know, when you start teaching, you're like, oh my God, what am I going to say? People are going to ask me questions I don't know the answers to. So I over prepare. You know, you have notes and notes and notes and notes, and then you get through maybe 1/10 of them. Mm-hmm. And then I had this epiphany one day when I was teaching, and I was nervous about something. And I thought, you know, I know more than they do.
Even on a bad day, I can still help them.
Right. And so once I had that realization, like, you know, it was totally fine. But my confidence in writing has just always been, like, you know, as a little kid, I don't think I got dropped on my head, but I had what we would call spilkas, which means I couldn't sit still. I still can't sit still very much, but back then, my legs would be shaking, and, you know, like, teachers would go crazy, like, what's wrong with this kid? And I just, like, all of elementary school, I don't think I learned much of anything because I couldn't sit still, I couldn't concentrate. So the sort of basics of grammar and construction of sentences and all of that are pretty much foreign to me. You know, I just never really got them. Somehow, when I got to, you know, the end of junior high and a little bit of high school, I calmed down and was able to learn things. So the visual language of films, like, I'm very sophisticated in that. But sitting down to write, just like the challenge of the open page, which for you, I'm sure, is not a problem.
It's like an unmarred snowfield that you get to traipse around in, you know, the blank page.
No, it's like what am I going to say? I got nothing to say. I don't know what to do.
You know, I had a college professor who gave us some instructions for an essay we were going to have to write. And I remember she said, every sentence in this essay had better be a mean, lean, meaning machine. And she wanted you to cut the fat and, you know, make every word count. That's how your writing feels to me. The sentences are lean. The pacing is good. it always is moving and imparting something important. I think you're a very engaging. I think you sell yourself short on that front.
Yeah, it's like it's confidence more than anything else. It's like I don't have any confidence that that I'm writing well, and that whereas when I'm editing, like I can stay up all night editing and like really spend a great amount of time constructing that so it just really works beautifully and sings. But to look at the sentence that I wrote and try to configure it and make it work better, I just have no patience. I just I want to be done with this. I don't even want to look at it. And I want it out of my life. So what you basically get from me is a first draft. Mm-hmm. Because I don't have that fondness for it. But I'm getting better. I tolerate a little bit better.
Do you feel that it would be wise or unwise to talk about your book ideas? I know you're working on some kind of cooking up some book ideas.
So yeah, so what does a person who like doesn't really like writing do? Like, well, I got 2 book ideas.
Are you a masochist?
Well, the problem is that I think I have things to say, and I like sort of telling people about stuff that I think is really interesting. Mm-hmm. And so, and another thing is, this sounds so crazy. It's like, my mother passed away a long time ago, and, I'm sure I was real trouble to my mother because I was not a very good student and couldn't pay attention and couldn't sit still. And publishing a book would prove to my mother that I'm not a total idiot. She's long dead. I'm a professor. I'm clearly not an idiot. But there's something in me that has like some sort of validation that I don't really need, but I do in a kind of strange way. So there are 2 ideas I have for books. The first one, Focal Press is interested in, and I've written a proposal, and it's going out for review, and if people like it, and it's really about how to not only just make films with your mobile device, but how to use it as sort of the storytelling center, both for viewing things and for making things. How to do podcasts with your phone. We could do it with this nice equipment, or we could do it with this.
Yeah.
And you could record it, edit it, distribute it all through your phone. And, everybody has a phone nearby them all the time. And I think if you want to be creative, there are so many things that you can do. And particularly now with the phone apps, the things that you can do are, totally extraordinary.
Yeah. That hits home with me, that what you're saying about the daily experience we have of using our phones was right at the core of the Go Show idea. Like how that even came to me is I thought, every day I get texts from friends with language, they've written, and sometimes written very well. I mean, I have a lot of writer friends, so maybe my text messages are a little better written than what most people are getting from their friends. I don't know, but I get a lot of well-written text messages, actually, contrary to the dominant idea that it's all trash and throwaway. It's not really the case.
Actually, throwaway culture is almost more profound and important than, stuff that's carefully constructed.
Yeah, it's like you can call it throwaway, but in fact, you want to hold on to these gems that that just pop. It's there's something really amazing about it.
A friend of mine named Rick Prellinger, who is an archivist, and he believes that the way you learn about culture is by what people like throw away and
what they discard, unthinkingly.
So he has collected all of those like industrial movies from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and how those really were the social engineering elements, how to relate to your family, what you're supposed to be, what a date is supposed to be. I mean, there's one called The Do's and Don'ts of Dating, all of that, which, isn't like so overt, it like comes across. And he's also at one point, I went to his place and he was getting what did we have before? We had text messages with beepers.
Mm-hmm.
So he was collecting beeper signals and sort of reading them as like, what are people thinking about?
Yeah.
And there's so much that in the unconscious mind of what you commit to communicate with
Yeah.
really taps into something that I think is really, kind of fascinating. And
Yeah, like I used to do this assignment where I would ask students in a poetry workshop to write what I called a prose preliminary. I got this idea from the Irish poet Yeats because he would do this. It's like write a prose preliminary, meaning just don't be uptight about it. You're not trying to write well. You're just putting down the idea for the poem, or at least moving towards the idea. And then write the poem and turn them both in. And it was kind of a trick because I knew, and from having done it before, that
preliminaries are going to be better.
That's where all the interest was,
Yeah.
because the students were loose. And they would have all this quirky, colorful detail that would never make it into the poem. My dog is making crazy noises back there.
Well,
Maybe I should try to get her into the shot right quick. There she is, everybody. Dickens.
hey, Dickens.
This is adorable. You want to say something?
But that level of preciousness.
Yeah.
And we were talking the other night about that experiment that I knew the experiment, but I didn't know who did it and under what context. That when you have people do a lot of work in the course of a semester, say, or have them only doing one work, that people who did a lot of work did much better work.
Yeah, I saw this story in James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. I'm not much on like self-help books, but I read that one because a friend of mine recommended it. So I thought, okay, I'll give this a try. We can always, get better at honing those kind of daily routines, because I've realized how much of your life is actually determined by your daily routines. And I think it's always been hard for me to have routines because of that dysregulation of sleep that I was talking about earlier. And so it's something that's a challenge for me. And in this book, Atomic Habits, James Clear tells a story about a photography professor. I think I read somewhere that he kind of tweaked this, that maybe in real life it wasn't a photography professor. I'm not sure. I think he messed with the details a little bit. But anyway, it's a good parable anyway.
It's a good story.
It's a good story. The idea was this photography professor had two classes, two sets of students. It was the same class. So he was like teaching two sections of Photography 101 or whatever. And or maybe it was an upper level class actually. And he told one group, he said, the only thing you're doing this semester is you're doing one photo and turning it into me. Now you can do as many as you want to practice, whatever you want to do, but you're going to be assessed on the quality of the merits of this one photograph. So you just want to make sure that you're really putting your best foot forward with that one photograph. And the students couldn't believe it. I mean, one photograph all semester long. In the other class, he said, all right, in this class, you're going to be assessed strictly on quantity. Honestly, your photographs can be trash. But if you turn in X number of photographs, and it was a high number, it was a lot he was asking them to do. If you can get this number of photographs done and turned in, you're going to ace the class. So it's all about the quantity. I know it seems strange, but that's really all I care about. At the end of the semester, almost all of the best photos were from the quantity class.
Yeah. And particularly, in still photos, it's like so much of this is capturing a moment. And if you are worried about the preciousness of that moment, it may never happen. I ever told you my LSD story?
No, I don't think so. Let's hear it.
So, growing up in the 70s, and 60s, 70s, LSD was all around. And, people told me, the first time you do LSD, it should be the right place with the right people. So I had a hit of acid that I kept in my pants pocket for 1 year.
Looking for the perfect moment.
And, this is nice, but, it's not quite perfect. And some of these people are nice, but it's not. So it's like at the end of the year, like nothing was perfect. And I said, I don't need this. It's okay. I'm not going to like stick this in my pocket for another year. And I never did it because, nothing was precious enough. When you have that notion that something has to be perfect, you often never get to that place. And the anxiety of trying to make it perfect. Whereas the spontaneousness, particularly in photography, of you're in this moment and you turn the camera on and the first 4 pictures aren't really interesting, but there's that one thing that you just happen to capture because you're doing an awful lot that really does make a difference. And so much of our life, we are trying to, I would say, waste some of our time to make things too precious rather than sort of, and it sometimes stops people. I can't tell you how many times people have don't do anything because this is a good idea, but it's not the perfect idea. There's got to be a better idea. This one's just not really good. And that is all tied into the great the thing that kills 90% of all creativity is fear of failure.
I went to the Montana Book Conference. I love the Montana Book Conference. They have they kick it off every year with something called, I think it's called Whiskey and Pie. They have this night where they just serve whiskey and pie. And also it's in Montana, which is glorious and terrifyingly beautiful. I love that state. I went to it to give a poetry reading, but they were having a keynote speaker one day. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go to this event and see what this is all about. And it was the writer Jane Smiley. And I think they may have surprised her. I'm not sure whether she knew that one of her former students would be there to do like a Q&A with her. And it was really a poignant moment. This young writer who was, I don't know, maybe early 30s or so, was up there on stage, and her career was going well. I think she had her first book and things were going well. And she said, Jane, I just want to tell you, you said something to me in my first year of grad school that changed everything. I mean, honestly, I'm not trying to oversell this. I don't think I would have a book. I'm not even sure I'd be in this career without this piece of wisdom, because it had such a dramatic effect on me. And Jane said, what in the world did I say that was, so helpful? And she said that she was very tight, like we're talking about. She just was worried about, she feared not writing well. It was paralyzing. And Jane said to her, listen, your first draft really only has one job.
Get you the next draft.
It's apparently the way Jane Smiley said it was, it just has to come into existence. That's its only job. Because once it has come into existence, you've got something to work with.
Right.
You might see that there's one phrase that you want to play around with and maybe use, or maybe it just becomes a launching pad for the next thing, but it's there. And so you're not just blinded and intimidated by the blank page.
Important. But the other thing is that there's a certain class of people who think of themselves as cool and talented and will be at many parties talking about how cool and talented they are. But once you commit to doing a piece of work, then you can be judged for not being as cool as you think you are.
Yeah.
And there is that fear that, or maybe I wrote something good and that was good once, and maybe people will judge me, and I'm afraid that I won't be as great as I think I am. I think that is very, very stifling for a lot of people. And what I tell my students all the time is that every artist at every level has some degree of fear of failure when they start a project.
Yeah. I heard Mary Jo Salter, a poet I think she's has been an editor of the Norton Anthology of Poetry, and she teaches at Johns Hopkins in the Writing Sims. She's a very successful writer. And she told me herself, she just in private conversation one day, she said, Greg, until I've got 10 good poems towards the next book, I'm always terrified that I won't be able to write anymore, that I've lost it. But once I get 10 poems, I'm like, okay, I think I can still do this.
So what I tell my students is, when Steven Spielberg starts a film, somewhere deep down in the back of his head, he'll say like, "What the fuck am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing." And then you start to move a little bit forward, and then your momentum and your ideas and your passion kind of comes forward. But realizing that it's something that is universal, that people feel, and I tell them to embrace that, because everybody has it.
Mm-hmm.
Once you've identified it, you said, "Oh, well, that's it. That means I'm an artist. That means I care, and I just understand that's part of the process. And if I didn't have that, it wouldn't drive me forward. But yeah, I'll get over that."
And the thing to fear, I think, is losing that beginner's sense of not knowingness, of not having the blueprint. Because if you do, you see a lot of artists start imitating their younger selves, and that's the saddest thing.
Now, you can use the pain of your younger self and the joy of your younger self in your work. But
if you're imitating it, trying to just capture some glimmer or some,
And imitation in general. I mean, I think the biggest problem in student films, particularly because I teach it, is that people try to imitate like feature films that they love, or they try to do genres that they like, and there's no sense of authenticity. That a film that you make has to come from some kind of experience you can relate to, that comes from, and that's when like it goes beyond just an actor talking, but something that's alive and meaningful.
Let me ask you a question about this, because this is something I've wrestled with. So Derek Walcott, who's a Nobel Prize-winning poet, very fine poet from the Caribbean, came to my graduate program to give a reading. And in the Q&A after his reading, I had long admired his work, so it was really a wonderful experience to see him read in person. After his reading, he was doing Q&A, and somebody asked him about finding your, how do you find your voice, that sort of thing. And he said, "I think imitation is absolutely critical. It's the most important thing. My first book, everybody said, 'Who is this person imitating Yeats?' Second book, 'Who is this guy imitating Eliot?' Third book, 'Who is this guy imitating Auden?' Fourth book, 'Where did this amazingly original voice come from?' And he said that it was recombinant, that he took a little bit, he imitated for a while this person, and then he imitated this other person, and then he imitated the other person. And pretty soon all these influences started swirling up together and mixing with folk materials from the Caribbean. And then he wound up with this
With his own
thing
voice
that seemed to have come out of left field, out of nowhere. So that's one model of moving towards your original voice. But I've heard other great writers say that, that's really not the way to do it. They're advocating for a process of finding what you're all about sooner, not going through this like long apprenticeship where you imitate a bunch of different people, but trying to get in touch with your own aesthetic early and pursue that. So how do you reconcile these two models?
Well, part of that is style, right? It's like you are imitating a style, but the stories, like if I was writing a story about something I didn't know anything about, I could do some reading about it, but it was nothing that I had an emotional connection to. So it's important to sort of either deeply study it so you know it really, 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 really well, and then you can relate to it because you've not just intellectually, but it sort of has a place in your mind, and everything you're doing is coming from that sense of knowing. And in another example, taking this in another way, like sometimes students will want to make a film about like a homeless man. And so what they'll do is they'll spend 15 minutes with a homeless man and then show me the footage. And it's like, that has nothing to do with that person's life.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing authentic because you haven't spent the time to understand the authenticity of that person's life. And how have you photographed him to sort of have how you see the world and how he's seeing the world? And so there's no level of authenticity anywhere in that. All you're doing is reproducing something that you saw on maybe a television show about what a homeless man was and the stories that they had. Or, for example, in almost every class, somebody will want to either do like a zombie movie or a hitman movie. And I'll say, like, well, unless you are a zombie or know a zombie, or you had a relative who was a hitman, you are not making this movie, because this doesn't at all, like, connect to your experience. And, later on, once you've found your voice and found yourself, you can then go into a genre piece, and then you're using your own experience to work within that sense of a genre. But as you're developing your voice, all you're doing is recreating these tropes without adding any bit of your own sense to that. So you are not moving towards being an artist, you're moving towards being a craftsman. And I think that a young maker needs to be developing their artistic voice, not just figuring out where to put the camera, although where to put the camera is important.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the kind of things that, as a teacher, we're both teachers, we spend a lot of time thinking about how to get people to do better work. But digging to themselves, it's like when they pitch a film to me, I say, why are you making this film? What does this film mean to you? Why is it different that you would make it than somebody else would make it? And there should be a good reason for that.
That's a good way of thinking about it. Because I've always been a believer in the benefits of imitation. I've seen it in my own craft. I can see, but I can also see that you can get lost in that. You can spend decades just kind of going over these same tropes and using these same techniques, and you've never actually asked yourself that a version of the question you're saying you put to students, which is, another way of thinking about it is this actually what you want to do? Is this what you feel moved to do?
Yeah, and I do have an assignment where they have to recreate a scene from a famous film. Mm-hmm. So they learn film language.
Technique and language, yeah.
Right. So how did a classic filmmaker set up this scene? And I think it's a very technical assignment. Mm-hmm. And it has to match frame for frame for how long, and have the wide shot, medium shot, close up, and all that. So there is that, but I really want students to, and I think that's a direction of a program. There are programs that are just trying to make you good craftspersons, and mm-hmm. I'm trying to find people who can express themselves in sort of powerful ways.
Yeah. And that whole question of how to balance the apprenticeship with the search for originality is probably something to be worked out with fear and trembling, to use the biblical language, person by person, not actually fear and trembling, but what I mean is it's an individual thing, and it won't be the same for two people.
And another thing that I'm sure both of us do is talking to our students about the work that moves us. Like when you talk about poems, I mean, how many things did you talk about? And it's not just explaining what it is, but what it meant to you, how you felt, what the words did to you.
Yep.
And when you're in front of your students and they're hearing what brings value to the work that you do.
Yeah, and I think there's a problem in the teaching of creative writing and of literature that has to do with teachability. I have heard several teachers privately confide that they rarely teach their favorite work, the work that actually matters the most to them. And one reason is that the thing that they love about it eludes their powers of articulation. There's something ineffable there. Ultimately, the whole matter of being won over by a work of art is a mysterious experience. And it's and there's this fear of not having anything substantive to say in the classroom when you're the professor. And I urge friends of mine to get that conversation into the classroom, because there's something beautiful about the humility that is demonstrated when somebody says, I actually don't know exactly how to say why I love this poem so much, but I do, and I don't want to not show it to y'all because there's something irreducibly mysterious about it. There has to be a way of getting that into the classroom, even though you can't say, look at this little technique and look at these 3 things I can show you about the craft of the poem.
You have to have enough confidence in yourself to feel comfortable doing that. And certainly, say, somebody who's up for tenure in a couple of years may not want to put themselves in a position where students are feeling like you're not sure what you have to say about something, because you don't want to seem like you're not knowledgeable or have thought this thing through.
A lot of times the work that you can explain, whose strengths you can articulate very clearly, is not the most compelling work. It's not always true, but that's often the case.
But also, I think so much of what's important for us is to get people to experience the works that you think are transformative for them, and have them reading and, in my case, watching films that I think will open their eyes up to the possibility that are beyond what they're thinking. So many film students, like, what kind of movies in the beginning of the semester, what do you like? And they're Marvel movies, sometimes. And so, you really have to show different kinds of films and show how excited you are about them and talk about them as having a different kind of meaning. And then they can start to appreciate more.
Yeah. I think there's a way of talking about a work of art that's not concerned with showing your conceptual mastery of the thing, or that you know exactly how it works and you can say why it's great. There's another conversation to be had about how the work challenges you or defies your powers of articulation.
This is what we figured out. This is the Brownderville dimension.
Well, this
is the space where we're trying to figure out these things that we can't necessarily articulate. That is the dimension.
I have a poem in my first book, Gust, called Mystery, that has the line, "Everything that matters is a mystery." And this may be an overstatement, but it's mostly true for me. Like, the things that really matter the most to me are mysterious. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true for a lot of people, actually.
It's true for some people. Some people don't deal with mystery very well. The certainty, if you don't have a certainty about it, that there's a problem, there's an insecurity.
But that even it's being a problem is a way of mattering. If you're deeply bothered by something, and people are deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity, a lot of folks are. If you're deeply bothered by something, that thing matters to you, or it wouldn't bother you. You're not bothered by things that don't matter to you.
Well, I think some people are just or they get bent out of shape on something that is unknown, or doesn't fit into a classical sense of what they believe is proper.
Yeah, I heard a psychometrician saying that.
A what?
A person a psychometrician that studies psychometrics.
What are psychometrics?
Well, like trying to make the contours of personality and characterological traits measurable in an experimental environment.
Got it.
In a scientific experiment. And so, there's personality science like Big Five theory that shows how certain there are basically 5 dimensions of human personality according to one of the more recent hypotheses. And there are ways of measuring creativity if you define it. You have to define it a certain way, and it may not be a satisfactory definition, but at least you can say, okay, we're going to define creativity this way, and we're going to devise these tests to see how creative people are. One interesting thing you were mentioning LSD is that
So if only I had taken that LSD back then, my life would be completely different.
well, people do. I think I read a study that said something like people who took psilocybin were one standard deviation higher as a matter of measurement in creativity, even like a year later, not like right after while it's happening or right, but like come back a year from now and you're still one standard deviation higher in creativity. But what it's the nature of creativity to be unhappy, to a creative person, it's the nature of a creative person to be unhappy in these little boxes that other people want to put you in. And so creative people will often question the parameters of the assignment, so to speak. It's like instead of just doing it well, there's a question about why is this the assignment? Why should... And so this psychometrician was saying that in some studies, creativity, high levels of creativity, and I think this may have been trait openness in the 5-factor analysis I was talking about, openness to new experience and ideas. If you're high in trait openness, which is basically high in creativity, that's negatively correlated with high achievement in graduate school. Because in graduate school, and this is probably not true of all disciplines, maybe it's not, but it's certainly true of some, you have to do a lot, and you have to really manage your time, and you have to stay on task. And people who are highly creative are often questioning the way the task has been defined and the parameters of the task, and so they don't do as well as a result. And it's so yeah, that whole thing about looking at the questioning the box that you've been put in is part of creativity, I think.
Well, first of all, I do think after my year of not doing LSD that I figured out that what other people were doing and the transformation that I had, I could sort of figure that out anyway. My mind was already kind of working that way. But there's a slight, I would say, a difference between being a graduate film student and being in a writing program. Because when you're making a film in graduate school, you've got a lot of resources you have to marshal together, a lot of people, a lot of pre-production. So it's like you have to be on a schedule. Like you can't just say like, oh, I don't feel like painting today. I don't feel like writing today, or that's not hitting me. I'll just be 2 weeks late. It's like if your crew is there, you have to, like, you can't put it off.
Yep.
So because of the scarceness of resources, and resources are necessary, and the time and limitations.
It all costs money.
Yes, yeah. Or, it's pretty hard to get everybody back the next day because you just don't feel like directing today. You don't have that luxury.
Well, this was something that interested me when you and I started working on Firebones, because there's an idea in the creative writing world, and one classic articulation of it is Robert Frost's essay, The Figure a Poem Makes, in which he says that no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. That it's the nature of good writing that it's surprising the writer. It's going places you didn't expect. And he has this memorable metaphor that when a piece of writing is going well, it's like a block of ice that's melting on a surface, and it's moving on its melting. It's moving around as it melts, and it's in ways you couldn't have mapped out ahead of time.
Oh, yeah.
And so I wondered about this in filmmaking, because, when you write the thing and then you go out and shoot it, I mean, you do know where the story is going when you start the principal photography. Whereas when you are writing a poem, you don't really know. I mean, you may have some idea, but so a learning experience for me that I really enjoyed was seeing how these same dynamics play out in filmmaking, but just in a different sort of dimension of the project. before I say anything about what I've observed about that, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, there is that same process. Certainly in writing a film, right? You start off and then you think it's this, and then as you're writing, there's like the writing takes over. Your characters write the pieces, and then just kind of moves along in the directions you weren't really thinking, and then you're looking at, oh, it's really going there. Okay, well, we'll just kind of go with that. But then the other steps along with that, that you do have to have, scheduling, and you have to have somebody like, okay, we're going to be at this location at this time, and we need these things to sort of be there. And then you're at the silo, and you realize, this is what we thought we were going to do, but there's this incredible opportunity if you go this way instead of that way, and that reinterpret this line or reinterpret this character. Or, the way the Beekeeper Spaceman is doing this is just so beautiful. Let's make that into a little more of a moment than we thought we were going to do.
Exactly. That's the thing that I loved seeing on set.
Right.
What you're articulating right now.
So you can't let the structure of what you have coming up and there's always the thing that was like, when you have this, it's like, okay, how many pages we have to get through? Our next location is this. We have to be out here. We don't get this done by that time. But the other thing is like, what can I do to make this moment completely different than what I thought it was going to be? And how do I see what's there? And, the thing about this Firebones project is that we had such an incredible cast and crew, which sounds like such a fucking cliche. Just like everybody says, our cast and crew is just so magnificent. It's like you have every press tour. That's the first thing that everybody says. But it was a truly magical, creative group of people where everybody would say something and that would be really great, or a new prop would show up and we'd figure out how to sort of use this in a more creative way. And the music would show up and that transformed the universe, or something happened and we were able, none of us were afraid to move in a different direction because we trusted everybody so much and listened to everybody so much. And there was this vibe amongst all of us that we knew that what we were doing in any moment was special.
Yeah, I remember when our brilliant director of photography, Christian Vasquez, and I were sitting in the car after the 2 or 3 days of principal photography. He said, Greg, I hope you know that what's happening with this project on set is highly unusual. Like, it usually doesn't feel like this. It's usually like super stressful and people are yelling at each other, and it's that great spirit on set, according to him, was something that's pretty unusual and that was special. I remember seeing certain moments of what you're talking about with seizing the moment, like seizing an opportunity. Like when we were at the silos, and this is a scene involving a character called the Beekeeper Spaceman, and yeah, there's more to say about that, but we were out at these silos, and all of a sudden there were a million blackbirds. And Christian saw that, and he asked somebody to go around and kind of scare the blackbirds into the shot. And that's something that you couldn't have predicted. I mean, we didn't know they would be there, but there's something about a radical openness and receptivity that you have to have on set to what's happening, because you're there. It's the limitation becomes the opportunity. It's like, we're here today. We're here in this moment. We ain't coming back. We don't have the budget for it. It's like whatever presents itself to us today is what we're working with. And so you have to, even though you're locked in on, managing a million things and getting this thing shot, you have to you have to have other eyes. You're open to whatever's happening. And I saw a number of times you and Christian and Kyle Montgomery, he was the working the camera with Christian. They would see something like, oh, look at this light. We've got to do something with this. There's this exquisite light right now, or something would happen just by chance, and we would take advantage of it in the moment. And it reminded me of the interpretation of a classical piece. Two pianists play the same piece of music, and they sound really strikingly different because the interpretations are different, and it's just how so you've got the script, but what are you going to do with that material the day that you're there, kind of playing the music?
And the magic. There's just so many times magical things happen. Light shows up in the background that you weren't. It just changes the way you feel.
And the magic of those blackbirds, because actually, and I don't even know if Christian knew this at the time, blackbirds were really important to other parts of the story, not just the videos. But like, there's a song on the album, but which is coming. Spencer Kinney and I, who did the sound design for the project, have formed a band. I wrote a bunch of songs for the project, and they're in the Go Show. Sometimes just one piece of the music, like a keyboard part or a drum part or something. They're all over the place in the podcast and videos. So he and I were working on the music even as we were sound designing the podcast, and that has turned into a full-length album that we're going to be releasing this spring in March and shipping vinyl like in May or June. So, and there's a song on the album about blackbirds, and there's no way Christian could have known that. But blackbirds were actually really, so it was almost like the hands of the gods or something bringing those blackbirds into the shot.
And the swans, I remember like we thought there would be one or two of them there, and there were like tons of them.
Yeah, those wild swans in Arkansas.
It was just, kind of magical. Like I had something in my mind in that shot, and what we had was just so much more profoundly
There are some
amazing
pieces of music in the Go Show that came into existence in the most curious way. We shot those wild swans, as you recall, in Arkansas, and we had quite a lot of audio. We had some Zoom H6s out there that, and got some pretty decent audio. And the swans were putting on a show. I mean, it was like improv jazz. And, I mean, they call them trumpeter swans. And I think that's for a reason. And I went back and listened to the audio, and there were these moments that were really interesting, like really cool melody lines, like little flourishes on the trumpet. And I cut those and put them into Logic and put a click track underneath, just like a metronome, and created these songs essentially. And then I got Jamal Muhammad, this master percussionist from Dallas, to come in and play Doombeck underneath the swan music. And it was to a click, so it was perfectly in time. And those little swan songs became pretty important to the kind of sonic texture of the Firebones universe.
Many things like that happen. I mean, it's great people coming to work and bringing things and seeing things, but yet getting it done on time. I mean, we were relatively efficient.
Yeah.
Amazingly so. And just, it was just wonderful. And, for me, this is so stepping out of my comfort zone. Because mostly I do documentary work. I've been teaching narrative films for a long time, but it's probably been 20 years before I directed something. And then, of course, like actually acting in it itself, which I still dubious that this was a good idea.
Yeah, that was daunting, I think, for both of us. To play ourselves in the show.
But I think, there's some of my favorite, there's a couple moments when we're just talking, walking and talking that are just really, it's not two characters, it's two friends who are walking.
One thing that I think comes through in the footage is that you and I were becoming close friends through the making of Firebones.
Absolutely.
Because we really met like right before we started working. I mean, we hadn't known each other any time when we started working on it. And so you can see that happening in the footage. And I thought Robbie Curtis, our video editor, did a good job of creating these montages that show that progression. And yeah, it really does come through in some of those episodes.
Yeah, it was a great joy to work together. And just for those people who don't, I mean, you called me up one day out of the blue, and we got together.
Had never met.
Right. And say, pitch this idea, which at the time was like there was something in California and something in Honduras, and there was and it was really, kind of exciting. And then, I think after the third time, I said, well, I don't know that I have a student. I think I'd like to do this.
Yeah, because initially a mutual friend of ours had suggested to me, well, Bart is doing a million things. He's running festivals. He's working on a million documentaries. He's teaching full time. He's writing. So he's not going to want to work on it. But he has a extensive network of former students who are now professional filmmakers, and he can probably connect you with people who could work with you on this. And I met and said, is there anybody that you would suggest? And I think you did mention Christian and some other people that might want to work. But the second time we got together, there was a big time lapse between the two because we were both so busy. So we met like in December, and then we met again in June.
God, was that far apart?
I think so. I went back and looked at the emails. This was in 2016. I had been working on the project, off and on since like 2011 with the writing and some of the photography and stuff. But it had been slow going, partly because I was writing poetry books at the same time. And it was at that moment I was like ready to go full steam ahead on it. And so I met with you. You said, let me think about it. We met at 10 Bells Tavern, which has recently been demolished, sadly. And then we met again, I think it was in June. We sat down, and I remember you kind of like slammed your beer down on the table. You're like, I want to work on this with you. Like these, and I was so happy because I never thought that you would actually want to get involved, but then that just opened up the world to me and the project because, you knew the people. Like I was not in the film world whatsoever. I didn't know the Dallas film world at all. You were like, this person is like Christian Vasquez is the director, someone over here, someone over there, like, and that just put everything into high gear, and we were able to start casting and moving ahead with it.
Well, it's very rare that you are able to like get onto a project that is just so completely different and kind of reinvent storytelling. And I've always been interested in things that are on mobile devices, and that really. And now
your book project, that is sort of related in a way too.
Absolutely, and I'm always up for trying completely new things. Like I'm very much now interested in projection mapping and trying to like place video onto buildings in different kinds of ways and creating different environments for people to see video. So I'm always trying to like find different ways that media can touch us that are non-traditional. Not that traditional stuff is not good, and I certainly do plenty of that, but new ideas, new ways. Always kind of infinitely curious to try something that just hadn't been done before.
Are your ideas about, you may not want to talk about them yet because they may be inchoate, but would you want to say anything about the projection mapping idea, or just you want to keep that under wraps for now until you develop it more?
I don't know about you, but like when I found out about like my ideas that I'm working on things, the more I talk about them, the more sense they make. There's something about verbalizing ideas that helps to crystallize it. And actually, the amount of leap that you get is dependent on the person you're talking to and how much you... so who knows? Maybe at the end of this, I'll certainly understand this thing better. So the project is tentatively called Living History. And the idea in broad strokes is that there are stories out there that happened in buildings that are some of the mostly really bad things that happened. So my idea is to find the stories in the Dallas-Fort Worth area on building, what happened in a building, work with theater companies or dance companies to develop these as stories, and then to literally project them with projection mapping onto the buildings where these things happen and create events that could either be all video or projection mapping and live acting to them, but to bring them to life and so that you're really experiencing the history so in a new kind of way so that it's not forgotten.
So say something for our listeners and viewers about what projection mapping actually is.
So most people sort of know what it is, just didn't know the word for it. So at some point, somebody has shown you a piece of video you saw off the internet or something like that, where there is a building and you can see in different parts of it different kinds of video images. So in the window, there'll be like somebody coming in and out, and then there'll be this monster moving along this way, and something else is going elsewhere. So instead of it just being one palette, there are many different things that you can turn on and off and move in different kind of ways. It can wrap around a building because you can program where it moves. And so it really makes it a completely different way of thinking about what a video image can be, rather than something that just goes on a flat wall. Mm-hmm. Now, you can put things within that wall in profound different ways, but the projection mapping is taking it to a whole level. Experientially, it's a major step forward. And just being in the presence of something with projection mapping is a sensory treat. I mean, you just like, the first thing you do is like, that's really cool. And then, okay, we got that. So, wow, can we make this meaningful, not just something that kind
a cool
of
factor
looks
kind
cool.
Of, yeah.
And has a kind of strong political and aesthetic meaning to it. And, I like to do things where you can experience work in ways that you weren't planning on. I did a series of curated work for Aurora on buildings in Dallas, some video art. One night we had some work from a Ukrainian artist. Or one of the projects I did many years ago that was just incredibly cool was the Omni Hotel, which has like the largest video screen in the Southwest. I mean, it's just used. The whole building has video. We talked them into letting us have video artists create original work for the wall. So any place where you could see the Omni Hotel, you could just pull over the side of the road and watch it. And it was just pretty amazing. But the absolutely amazing thing that we did that I still can't believe we were able to do was KXT broadcast the soundtrack. So any place where you could see the screen and turn your radio on, you could experience this work. It was just
awesome.
An amazingly cool thing.
Like a drive-in movie kind of thing.
Right. Except it was kind of video art drive-in movie. And and we literally had to figure out like how you create work on this wall, because it's like 1,000 pixels across and 20 down. Like each floor is a 1 pixel down. So the refresh rate didn't work well. So you would work on a project, look at it on your computer, and it looked great. And then we would do a test run on it, and it was just like the motion didn't work. So you had to like find the language of projecting on a hotel wall. It was kind of bizarre.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. I can see all kinds of applications for that kind of storytelling.
But it's just the idea that, you can experience work and where you weren't really expecting it. And those are the kind of things that can help you think about your world differently.
Yeah, that's what interests me about new technology. It's not so much the bells and whistles, it's the way it can revivify our ideas about storytelling, like with the Go Show idea that, as I was saying, you get people send you videos, they send you photographs, they send you texts. We're having this interactive digital experience every day, all the time on our phones. And so I thought that can be the basis for an art form. And that's the way a lot of art forms are. I mean, we talk to each other in words, and if you do the best you can with words, it's called poetry or literature. We move our bodies, but if you do that artistically, it's called dance. So the idea of these technologies that have come into our lives, creating bases for new art forms, is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, and I think you are relatively unique in your interest in taking traditional poetry and bringing it into new ways, using new technologies or new formats, and also taking a literary magazine and just sort of opening up the idea of what a magazine could be that deals with literature, that is not just a bunch of poems looking a certain kind of way, that opening up to comic art and having film reviews on the website and having a QR code that brings you up some acoustical material that's really very powerful, and just reimagining how you challenge the reader to confront words and to have aesthetic experiences with words in a magazine that is not like anything they've experienced before.
I think, there's something about poetry that it's a stripped down kind of, I think of William Wordsworth wandering the Lake District of England and writing poems in his head. Like, he didn't even need paper and pen. You don't need much to write a poem. It's just the human being with language in their imagination. And so, given that it's such it's so close to the body itself, people who are inclined to write poetry are usually, and there are notable exceptions to this, not so inclined to work with gear and crews and all that, because it's sort of the thing that draws you to poetry is that closeness.
There is no interface of technology.
Right.
It's like you and the material, and it's very low tech.
Yeah, it's just like pretty much your body. And so, yeah, Dickens is back there.
You notice
making
the
rhythmical noise
of that,
Exactly.
right? He's saying it like the pace. You need to pick up the pace. It's too slow.
And yeah, so one thing that we're doing in the new issue of Southwest Review, the winter issue, 2022 winter issue just came out. We just started shipping it this week. And this thing called Sound Story has been so fun. We took this story by the Ecuadorian writer Gabriela Alemán, which is called War of the Worlds. It connects with the whole like Orson Welles history. So the story is kind of about audio, and Spencer and I, my bandmate in Beekeeper Spaceman, he and I worked together to produce this piece of sound. He sound designed it by himself beautifully. We have this sound designed version of Gabriela's story with the voice actor Gabriel Giron Vives from Dallas did the voice acting. Well, so there's this sound designed piece of audio. Well, the way you access it is you get the print magazine, and there's this beautiful art spread by Sam Ward. I love the art he did. And there's a QR code. I don't really like how QR codes look, so I really challenge the artist to make it kind of subtle. It's sort of woven into the art in a way that seems organic. If you scan that QR code, the little piece of the art where the QR code was, which was kind of hiding something, it's revealed in its fullness. So there's kind of a reveal there, like what was behind that QR code. Well, you find out on your phone screen. It pops up on your phone, and then you get these options like listen on Spotify, listen on Apple Podcasts, listen on SoundCloud, and you click it, and then you're listening to the sound designed audio. So we're calling this series Sound Story. This is the first installment. So I hope folks will order the winter issue to experience this. It's a really cool thing, and I think it's the first time a magazine's done quite this exact thing. I haven't seen this particular way of handling the visual art and the audio and with the text. So I think we're going to keep doing it. It was fun.
Well, I just think the idea of expanding the magazine beyond the words, I think is really kind of important, and you've been doing that since taking over the magazine and the journal from the beginning.
Yeah,
it's trying to make it unstuffy and to broaden the idea of what a journal could be. So in the way that it's structured in the university, it's like it's rare in modern universities to sort of have a free hand in this.
Yes.
Where you don't have to quantify everything.
I'm so grateful to SMU for not closing the doors on it a long time ago. A lot of magazines have gone by the wayside. But Southwest Review is the third longest running literary magazine in the country, behind the Sewanee Review, which is the oldest, and then the Yale Review. It was begun in Southwest Review was begun in 1915. At first, it was at UT Austin. Then it was kind of a joint thing between SMU and LSU. But then LSU started Southern Review, and since then, Southwest Review's been at SMU. Yeah. So to the university's credit, they've kept it going.
So, Greg, what do you see yourself doing in 10 years?
I think I think this new direction that was really initiated with Firebones, and to an extent with some work I did with Jacob Cooper starting in 2014 and in 2016, he and I did a piece that was commissioned by the Los Angeles Philharmonic that we premiered at the Disney Hall in LA in 2016. That was a video meets poetry meets music collaboration. But then Firebones was taking that to the next level. I think I want to stay with that. I want to continue writing and publishing poetry books, but I want to keep that in conversation with these other ventures. I want to keep doing video work and music. I mean, Beekeeper Spaceman, the band that I've started with Spencer, is like one of the most fun things going in my life right now, and I'm so excited about the album coming out this spring. So, and music, I've been playing music since I was a little bitty kid. So I think for the first phase of my professional career as a writer, I was just doing poetry as far as the world was concerned. Like that's what I was putting out. But really, I think I've always wanted to keep doing all this stuff, have my hand in a lot of different things. And so I don't know exactly what form it'll take, but I think I'm going to stay with this.
You redefine what your artistic practice is. The artistic practice brings all of these otherwise disjointed pieces together, and they feed off each other, so that so you think of yourself as, in a sense, it's a bad word, but a multimedia artist. Yeah,
like right about 7 years ago or so, I read a book called Celestial Twins. My editor, Dave Smith, who has a new book out, book of poetry out. Dave is my editor at LSU, the series I publish poetry books on. He recommended this book. This book, Celestial Twins, shows that for the ancient Greeks, music, dance, and poetry combined to make one art form. What they didn't think of like poetry over here, dance over here, music over there. This was one thing, and that inspired me. I thought, you can define. It's not some law that came down from the heavens that these things have to be kept separate. And SMU has been wonderfully supportive of my efforts to mix up the world in this way. These artistic worlds. So I feel like I'm at a great place at SMU for this. So I'm really grateful to my colleagues for supporting that. Yeah. And, as long as I'm in a position to have fun in all these different domains and mix them up, I think I'm just going to keep doing it.
So you are headed out of the country in a couple days.
Yeah, going to Wales. It's a lovely language, and one thing I really admire about the Welsh is that they have kept their literary world alive, even though it's not as if there are millions upon millions of Welsh speakers and people who can read Welsh, but there's such a strong literary culture in that country, and there's a wonderful literary history, and they've just kept it going. And there are a good number of Welsh speakers, and kids speak it fluently in certain parts of Wales, and so it's not a language that's hanging on by a thread. And the folk culture is really fascinating to me. I've always been interested in this Christmas time celebration called Ivari Lloyd in Welsh, but I think in English you'll see it as Madi Lloyd, which means female horse, the gray mare. And what happens with the Madi Lloyd is that there's the real horse skull on a stick. Somebody's holding it, and then there's a sheet covering the person holding it. and there are these like singers that are flanking the Mighty Lloyd, and the Mighty Lloyd goes from door to door asking the person at the door to let her in, and there's an English storyteller named Hugh Lupton, and he's a songwriter and poet who has this beautiful song called Mighty Lloyd, in which, well, it's sort of, this is some of my favorite folklore is the folklore about the folklore. So the Mighty Lloyd is folklore, but then there's folklore about that folklore, and there's this one idea that's alive in the folk imagination in Wales, is that when the Mother Mary came to the stable needing a place to give birth to the baby Jesus, the Mighty Lloyd was pregnant at the same time and about to give birth in that same stable, and she was pushed out into the bitter night winds, and for 2,000 years has been wandering, looking for a place where someone would let her in because she's aching with foal, as Hugh Lupton says in his beautiful song. There's a performance by Chris Wood of this song on YouTube, and I think it's on Chris Hughes's YouTube channel. It's such a lovely song, really beautifully written. And the idea is the Mighty Lloyd is going from door to door. Will you let her in? And so I'm going to get to see the Mighty Lloyd in person this winter at Christmas time. So I'm really excited about that. And a number of other like folk celebrations I'm going to be able to participate in and see.
Hearing you talk about this, it really makes me think that aside from the writing, and of course you have this great talent for listening to the way that people talk and a great love for hearing that. But there's also like a strong sense of cultural anthropology that these legends, these stories, these rituals are very deeply important to you. And while other people may think of them in some way, for you, a lot of the words that are used and how they're used and the songs that are going along with that, as well as the kind of sense of performance. And so whereas instead of, say, just simply recording this, which you will probably do, but then using this like the Lagioni in Firebones, is like bringing this out in a new kind of way for a new kind of audience.
Yeah.
These rituals that happen in very small places that only a very few people ever get to experience have great significance to you and really help you see that. And what you bring to us is letting us see what you're seeing in there and the value of these things, which of course makes us think about what are the rituals that we have in our lives that actually have a sense of meaning that to us are kind of throwaway culture that we don't really, pay attention to.
Yeah, I'm gonna get a chance to meet and talk with, for the Greg Brownville Dimension, the world's leading expert on the British ritual year, the historian Ronald Hutton, who teaches at the University in Bristol, England. I'm going to get to sit down with him and talk about these things. His scholarly work, he's studied and written about a number of things, but one thing he's written about a lot is the festival year in Britain. And I asked him to wear a collared shirt so I could put a lav on him. And he said, I always wear a collared shirt. You should be warned. The Mighty Lloyd does not. So, because the Mighty Lloyd's like, this hobby horse in a cape. But anyway, yeah, one thing he says in one of his books is that whereas these rituals used to be communal, large numbers of people would participate, increasingly you're seeing smaller groups and even down to the family. And one thing I've been thinking about is that I think art is another place where these things can survive. So, it's not as if there are hundreds upon hundreds of Americans going to Lagiani in French colonial Missouri, but people can access that experience through Firebones. So Hutton is saying the family traditions, our family traditions can be a locus of ritual involvement. But I also think art can be. That's one thing I may run by him in our conversation.
Okay, so speaking of that, tomorrow you're heading to your home,
Pumpkin
Ben, and you're about to spend a few days with your family celebrating Christmas. So what kind of rituals do you have with your family during this holiday?
One thing that we've done many years, was not every single year, but often, is there's this hawthorn tree called sugar haw. This tree puts on a red berry that people in that area used to decorate their homes with at Christmas time. And you can make a beautiful jelly out of sugar haws. So I haven't decided whether I'm going to do it this year, but what I do a lot of years is go out with my nephew and gather the sugar haws. And you bring them back, and it's kind of labor intensive. You have to cap the berries one at a time, and you get them ready to make the jelly. And that's sort of the beauty of it, because it becomes, you make a day of it. You're sitting around, everybody has a few in a bowl, and you're just capping those sugar haws and taking the blossom ends off and getting them ready. And it's these red berries, so they look kind of Christmassy. And then you make this beautiful, like, pale pink, sometimes it can be a little orangey, sometimes it's just pale pink, depends on the year, jelly that's delicious and my mother makes amazing homemade biscuits. So that's a Christmas tradition I really love. Going out into the woods, finding the sugar haw trees, picking them, bringing them back, working with them, getting them ready, and then when you finally cook them down, the jelly is so beautiful. And then when you get them in the jars, all through the night you hear them popping, like the pinging of those lids when they're sealing. It's like ping, ping, and they start making that noise, and that's when they're sealing. And then the next day you can open one up and put it on a buttered biscuit.
Well, I truly expect that you'll take some photos of that.
Yeah, if we do it, I'll definitely get some footage.
Yeah, bring some back.
Oh yeah, bring you a jar.
Yeah, we'll have to get some biscuits.
All right, Bart. Well, this has been a delight to sit and talk with you. And
we'll have a great time in Christmas. I hope it's really meaningful to you. I'm sure you'll also play some music with your family.
Yeah, sit around with my brother and my dad, play some music.
Yeah.
We always do that.
Hope nobody gets exploded in the air or anything.
No tractor explosions. All right, Bart. We'll have to have you back sometime. This was fun.
It's great. Good to be here. Thank you so much.
See you next time.